32, the $3 Amish spider spray that clears a basement forever, safe for pets. Lethal for bugs, cold air moves through the basement like it owns the place. You can feel it on your wrists. A single cobweb stretches from pipe to wall, trembling when the furnace kicks on. There's a jar sitting on a wooden shelf downstairs, half forgotten, worth exactly $3 in parts. And something about that jar never made sense to me. Because the spiders down here don't behave like they're being killed. They behave like they're being asked to leave and actually listening. You clean them out on Saturday. By Tuesday, they're back in the same corners. Why does that happen? Why did one neighbor tell me he hasn't seen a basement spider in years without spending more than pocket change? And what is it about a simple mixture that seems to change the way a house is read by the things living in it? The answer starts in a place most people stop looking, right where the dust settles again. There's a kind of knowledge people use to pass quietly from kitchen to kitchen without much explanation. If you've ever dealt with a stubborn corner of your own home that never seems to stay clean, you already understand why this matters. If you've got a story like that, leave it below. I read those closely. And if these old, simple ways of working with a house instead of against it feel familiar, you'll probably recognize what comes next. There's a kind of knowledge people used to pass quietly from kitchen to kitchen without much explanation. If you've ever dealt with a stubborn corner of your own home that never seems to stay clean, you already understand why this matters. If you've got a story like that, leave it below. I read those closely. And if these old, simple ways of working with a house instead of against it feel familiar, you'll probably recognize what comes next. The next thing I learned down there didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. I remember standing at the bottom of the stairs, can of spray still in my hand, thinking I had finally done enough. The smell was sharp enough to sting my nose. It clung to the concrete like a warning sign nobody reads. For a day or two, it felt like I had won something. Then I saw the first thin strand again in the same corner, not a new place, the same one. That's when the idea started to feel less like frustration and more like confusion. Because if something was truly being eliminated, it shouldn't keep returning to the exact same habits. It should break the pattern. But it didn't. It repeated it. Slowly, I started noticing that most of what I was doing wasn't removal. It was interruption, a kind of temporary silence. The spiders weren't gone. They were just displaced for a short time, waiting out whatever smell or residue had changed the air. And that's a different thing entirely. Somewhere along the way, pest control became something that resets on a schedule. Spray, wait, repeat. Spray, wait, repeat. Like the problem is supposed to return so the solution can stay relevant. That rhythm didn't feel accidental anymore once I saw it from inside a lived-in space instead of a store aisle. There's a kind of structure that profits when nothing ever fully settles. Not just with pests, but with anything that comes in recurring cycles. The more you look at it, the more it starts to resemble maintenance instead of resolution. Down in that basement, I started thinking less about spiders and more about why the space itself never stayed quiet for long. Because that's what it is when it's right. Quiet, not empty, just still. A neighbor of mine worked construction most of his life. Once said barns taught him more about pests than any product ever did. He wasn't talking like a professional, just a man who spent too many winters fixing things that broke the same way twice. He said you don't kill your way into a clean barn. You change what the barn is offering in the first place. He pointed to the air gaps, the damp boards, the corners where dust gathers without being touched. That's what they read, he said. Not in so many words, but that was the meaning. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But later, I kept hearing it again in different forms. Old sheds, cellars, basements that stayed strangely calm without much effort at all. The pattern wasn't force, it was condition. Spiders don't arrive in a space randomly and stay for punishment. They follow what holds steady: moisture, shelter, still air. Places where their movement leaves no disruption behind. If those conditions stay the same, so does everything else. And if something changes those conditions even slightly, the pattern shifts. That's where the idea of signal started to make sense, even if it sounds too simple when you say it out loud. A basement isn't just a space, it's a set of cues: temperature, scent, residue, airflow. Things you don't think about until they're different. I began paying attention to what didn't get cleaned as much as what did. The invisible layer left behind after sprays, the damp film that returns after humidity rises. The corners that never fully dry no matter how many times you try. It's not dramatic, it's gradual. And gradual things are the hardest to notice while they're happening. There's one detail I should be honest about here. This isn't a total shut-off switch. It doesn't turn a basement into something sterile or untouched. That's not how real spaces behave. Some spiders will always find their way in from time to time, especially if conditions outside push them in. That's just reality. But what changes, at least in my experience and in what I've seen in similar homes, is how often they settle, how long they stay, whether they decide a place is worth mapping out or just passing through. That distinction matters more than most people realize at first. Because most frustration comes from repetition, not presence. And once you see that, the whole problem starts to look different. Less like an invasion, more like a pattern responding to something you can actually influence. I didn't have the answer yet, not the full one. But I had enough to stop trusting the cans on the shelf the same way I used to. And that jar sitting quietly near the stairs started to feel less like decoration and more like a missing piece I hadn't understood yet. That's where things turned again. Because whatever was in that simple $3 mix wasn't working the way I expected at all. The jar was already on the table when I finally decided to look at it properly. Nothing fancy, nothing labeled. Just glass, faint residue on the sides, and that quiet feeling that it had been used more times than it had ever been discussed. The kitchen light made it look even simpler, almost too simple for all the frustration it sat above. I remember thinking how strange that is. How the most overlooked things in a house are usually the ones doing the most steady work. $3. That's what it came out to in my head. Not because someone sold it that way, but because if you had to replace what was inside it, that's about what you'd spend pulling it together from a normal kitchen. No special trip, no store aisle that promises advanced protection. Just what most homes already have sitting quietly in a cabinet. I'll walk through it the way it was shown to me, but slowly. Because the point isn't speed. It's understanding what each part is doing when it meets the space you're trying to calm down. The base is something common, vinegar. The kind that already lives under most sinks. Nothing mysterious about it. What matters isn't the name, it's the way it changes the surface it touches. It doesn't sit there politely. It shifts what lingers on glass, on concrete edges, on the thin invisible film that builds up in damp corners. That's the first layer. Then there's something lighter added in. A small amount of oil, just enough to spread and hold the mixture in place instead of letting it vanish instantly. Not heavy, not sticky. More like a thin memory that stays on the surface a little longer than water would. And then there's a third piece. This part varies depending on who's making it. In some homes, it's something aromatic from the kitchen. Something strong enough to interrupt the stillness in a corner without overwhelming the room itself. The exact combination isn't what people argue about in those old conversations. What they care about is the effect it creates when all three meet a space that's been holding still air for too long. Because that's where the shift happens. You don't pour it everywhere. That's where most people go wrong when they try to copy something like this. They think more coverage equals more control. But old methods tend to work the opposite way. Small, deliberate lines instead of flooding the space. Corners first, then the edges where wall meets floor, behind stored boxes where air barely moves. Along the paths where you actually notice movement when the basement is quiet at night. Not random, mapped. And this is where the explanation becomes important, because without it, it just sounds like another homemade mixture. But the behavior change is what matters. Spiders don't react in the way people imagine. They respond to consistency in their environment. They build paths where conditions stay predictable. Temperature, moisture, scent traces. These things form a kind of invisible layout they follow. When that layout gets interrupted even slightly, the space stops reading the same way. Not destroyed, not erased. Just less stable in the way they prefer. That's why the effect isn't immediate in a dramatic sense. It's subtle. You notice fewer repeated corners being rebuilt. You notice more passing through instead of settling. You notice less of that same corner reclaiming itself every few days like it owns the calendar. There's a temptation here to make it sound stronger than it is, to say it wipes everything out or guarantees silence, but that would be dishonest. In my experience, and in what others quietly describe when they talk about similar setups, it works best as a shift in behavior, not a total removal. Especially in homes where humidity or older construction already plays a role, and that's important to say out loud. because nothing about this replaces basic upkeep. Dry corners still matter. Air movement still matters. No mixture fixes neglect. It only changes what the space does when you've already done the basics. I should also say this clearly, because it's where people sometimes misunderstand it. It's not a poison. It's not about force. It's about making a place less readable in the way pests rely on. There's a difference there that matters more than most people think. Around this point, I usually think back to something an older man once said while fixing a shed door in the cold. He said, "You don't win against small things by being stronger. You win by making the place stop speaking their language." At the time, I didn't fully understand it, but standing in that basement, watching how the corners slowly stopped looking claimed, it started to make a different kind of sense. Even the way you feel down there changes. Less tension in the air, less expectation of finding something you don't want to see. And somewhere in that shift is the real reason people keep coming back to old methods like this, even when modern options are louder, stronger, and easier to buy. Because what they're really looking for isn't control in the aggressive sense. It's quiet. A house that doesn't keep asking you to fight it every few days. And once you've seen that difference, even once, it's hard to unsee where the real problem was sitting the whole time, not in what was being removed, but in what was being allowed to return. And that's where the next part becomes unavoidable. The strange part is how quickly you notice silence once it returns. Not complete silence. Just less of the small interruptions you stop naming. Down there in the basement, it wasn't like something dramatic happened overnight. There was no moment where everything changed at once. It was slower than that. Almost polite, the way it faded. Corners that used to demand attention stopped asking for it so often. The same places still existed. Same concrete, same beams, same cold seams where the air settled, but they didn't feel as occupied anymore. You start to understand something simple at that point. Most problems don't vanish, they loosen, and that changes how you live with them. There's a habit people fall into without noticing. They treat recurring problems like something that must be defeated completely or ignored completely. But homes don't really work in extremes like that. They respond to rhythm, to small adjustments held over time. That jar on the shelf taught me more about that than any store product ever did. Not because it was magical, it wasn't, but because it didn't behave like something that demanded constant attention. It behaved like something that changed the conditions quietly enough that you forgot it was doing anything at all. That's usually how the older ways work. Not loud, not urgent, just steady. I remember checking the basement one evening after a stretch of damp weather. Normally, that would have been when things started to return. The first thin lines, the rebuilding in corners that always seemed to reappear after rain. But it didn't show up the same way, not gone. Just less settled. Fewer of those repeated patterns in the exact same spots. More passing through than claiming space. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because most frustration comes from repetition, not presence. A single spider doesn't change much. A pattern that keeps rebuilding in the same corner does. That's what wears people down over time. Not the sight of it, but the feeling that no matter what you do, it resets itself. And when that feeling eases, even slightly, everything else feels lighter. There's something my grandfather used to say about places like that. He didn't talk in technical terms. He didn't break things into systems or theories. He just said, if it keeps coming back, the house is telling you something you haven't heard yet. At the time, I thought he meant cleaning, or effort, or discipline. Now I think he meant attention. Noticing what stays the same even after you try to change it. The routine after that became simple, almost unremarkable. A monthly pass through the same corners. Nothing obsessive, just enough to keep the space from drifting back into old habits. Not a battle. More like maintenance of tone, and the house responded to that kind of consistency in a way I didn't expect at first. It stayed quieter, not perfect, just less reactive. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear about these kinds of old methods. They expect transformation, a hard line between before and after. But most homes don't operate that way. They shift gradually, based on what they're being given over time. If you take anything away from all of this, it's probably that. Small inputs, repeated steadily. Over time, they matter more than any single strong response. There is one honest limit I should say clearly here, because it's important not to pretend otherwise. This doesn't make a house immune to anything. It doesn't seal off the world. Weather changes still matter. Moisture still matters. And in certain seasons, you'll still see movement again, especially in older structures where gaps and dampness are part of the design itself. That's just reality. But what does change is how often the space feels like it's resetting itself against you. And that's where the real relief sits, not in perfection, in reduction, in fewer returns to the same frustration, in not feeling like every few days you're starting over from zero. Over time, the basement stopped feeling like a problem I had to manage constantly. It became just another part of the house again. Storage, quiet, unremarkable in the best way. And that might be the most honest measure of all. Not whether something is completely gone, but whether you can stop thinking about it. Before I left it alone for good that night, I stood at the bottom of the stairs a little longer than usual, just listening, not for anything specific, just noticing the absence of the small signs I used to look for automatically. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I needed to fix anything immediately. Just live in it, quietly, like a house that finally stopped speaking too loudly. And somewhere upstairs, that old jar stayed where it always had been, like it was never meant to be noticed in the first place.